Welcome, everybody, to our latest webinar, Native Birds Need Native Plants with Brigit Burbank. My name is Amanda Ray, President of Wild Ones Greater Baltimore, and I'm here with Ann Neo, Vice President, and Brigit Burbank is our Secretary. And she's also really knowledgeable about native plants that attract our native birds. I'm going to briefly talk about wild ones. If I can get to the next screen, there we go. So for those of you who are new to Wild Ones, there'll be a few slides here talking about us. We like to promote the use of native plants through local and national educational programs. We have 94 chapters and 36 seedling chapters. That means it's a new chapter in 36 states. And the organization just keeps growing and growing. And if you would like to join, if you haven't already become a member, you can go to join.wildones.org. In Maryland, we have 5 chapters. We have the nation's capital region, our chapter, Greater Baltimore, which spans quite a distance. And we have Chesapeake Bay chapter, and Frederick is the new chapter, along with Delmarva is another new chapter. One of the visions of Wild Ones all across the country is native plants and natural landscapes thriving in every community. And the shared mission is to advocate for native landscapes through education and community action. And we have shared core values to respect each other, nature, and the earth. We're an inclusive community and we welcome everyone. We share the latest evidence-based strategies, and we grow through learning, action, and sharing of knowledge. And we are hoping to be putting together some more hands-on activities for our members, coming up with some partnerships with other organizations that are like-minded. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Brigit. She is our speaker today, and I'll make one little anecdote about Brigit. She's been birding for about 4 years now, and she came here recently, and we were talking about plants, and she said, "Do you know that you have some goldfinches in your yard?" And I looked around, I didn't see any, and she knew what the call sounded like, and she promptly got out her binoculars and said, "Would you like to see them?" I said, "Absolutely." So she knew right where to look, and there they were. Really, really beautiful birds. So that was a lot of fun. I always appreciate people that have knowledge of what all the calls sound like. Okay, Brigit, take over here.
Okay, let's see. I'm gonna try and share. Okay, does that look correct?
I think I'm still sharing here. Hold on, let me. Oh yeah, I see it now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
No, but to me, it doesn't look
presentation.
like your presentation. I can see your notes.
Yeah, so presentation mode, I think. Whichever.
Mine? Hang on.
There we go.
All right.
It said,
Now?
it
Yep.
said, yeah, we can see it.
And it's not, okay, great. Great. Okay. So I am going to go ahead and start then. So I'm Brigit Burbank. I have spent, as Amanda mentioned, the past like maybe 4 years or so consuming just tons of content about native plants and birds. I personally find it really calming, looking at birds and learning about them, learning about how to support them. And so as a non-expert myself, I'm going to be teaching you sort of what I've learned through readily available resources like podcasts, some short articles, and then I'm going to share some resources that I thought were really accessible and interesting and informative for people that are also, you know, at a similar level, just trying to learn some of the stuff so they can help the birds. Towards the end of the talk, I'm going to talk about a project I created with my friend Kevin Marshall. It's a project that I hope anyone on this webinar can participate in. If you're interested, it's a grant-funded project to build a native plant garden underneath Heron Rookery in Thames Street Park. And we're going to talk all about it towards the end of the presentation. Because this is a grant project, it's a restoration and community education project, which means that we sort of have an obligation to show that we did some sort of education aspect. So this webinar is part of that. And then we'll also be offering 3 in-person tours. The first of which is coming up May 17th, and there are a few slots remaining. And then the next one will be in June, and then after that in July. And then we'll be doing our planting in October. So for everyone that's joined today, I have a survey, like a pre-participation survey. If you can, please, please, please take it. I also hate surveys, and I am so, so sorry. But please take it if you can, and answer honestly. There's like 9 questions, so it's not too long, but it's part of the grant. And so sort of as tax for joining us today, if you could please take the survey, that'd be amazing. And anybody who does take the survey and shares their email with me can be signed up to receive event notifications. And I'll talk more about the events towards the end. So somewhere I can find my presentation. Okay, there we go. So I imagine at least some of the people on here are gardeners. So along the way, I'm gonna sort of be making recommendations for gardeners on what and how to plant to attract birds through food and through nesting sites. And also, as Amanda mentioned at the beginning, a lot of gardening is just noticing. It's just noticing the birds in your garden, listening for them and watching how they interact with what you've put in your space. I think is one of the most exciting parts about gardening, especially gardening with native plants. So I want to give everybody a new thing to notice. So we're going to discuss 2 different aspects of how native plants sort of support native birds, and that's through food. So as you might know, native plants feed birds. We're also going to discuss some invasive plant species and how that kind of changes things for birds. We're going to talk about plants as habitat and how they are important for covering and nesting habitat, and also how structure brings the biodiversity. So a lot of these are ecological concepts, and ecology is, a branch of science concerned with the interrelationships of organisms and their environment. And as probably many people on this webinar are hopefully familiar with Doug Tallamy. He says an ecosystem is something like a machine. It runs better with all of its parts. So let's talk about plants as food. So the simple answer to why native plants feed native birds is that they co-evolved over time to depend on each other. So if you've ever explored some of Doug Tallamy's work, he discusses this in detail. So I'm not going to do his whole talk. I would wholeheartedly recommend any of his books. I think there are recordings of his lectures if you haven't caught any in person. I know he's come, I think, to Silburn. I saw him in person at Silburn at one point. He makes the rounds, so if he's ever in town, I would highly recommend hearing him talk. But his whole theory is that or what he talks about is that, you know, insects specialize on certain types of native plants. You may have heard the term, you know, X plant is a host plant, you know, maybe for the checker spot butterfly or something. Birds also specialize, not quite to the same degree that insects do, but they do have diets that rely on a set of native plants to feed them. And we're going to talk about some of those specifics. So what are bird diets composed of? Many species of birds only eat insects, so planting fruit-bearing shrubs and trees is not going to provide the resources that birds need. Most birds that eat fruit do not rely on berries alone either, because they need nutrients like protein and calcium to raise their young. About 96% of bird species raise their young on insects. There are a few exceptions, like finches do provide like a paste they make from some seeds, but most birds, as you can see, 96% need those insects in order to feed their young. So baby birds also need those nutrients to grow their feathers, and providing plants that supply insects for our birds year-round is going to be the most beneficial way. While berries are helpful for part of the year, they don't necessarily always provide, you know, complete year-round nutrition. So as an example of how bird diets change over the season, this is the diet of the yellow-rumped warbler. So in the summer, it's primarily eating insects like caterpillars, leaf beetles, weevils, ants, and aphids. Sometimes as gardeners, we bemoan aphids and we want to know, you know, what chemicals or sprays, what should we do to get rid of them? But, you know, if you get rid of aphids, you also are not going to see the aphid predators, and the yellow-rumped warblers are very sweet and they do migrate through here. And they will eat the things like aphids. So during migration in winter, they're going to be eating the fruit of bayberries. If people have heard of bayberries, are a pretty common shrub that you can find at nurseries. So that's the northern bayberry. There's also a southern bayberry, also called waxen myrtle. They eat juniper berries. They also eat poison ivy, grapes, Virginia creeper, and dogwood. They also eat seeds, so like beach grasses and goldenrods. Now blue jays and oaks have a very special relationship. How can I do a question in the chat? Do people know how many acorns blue jays cache, like per day and per season? They're sort of one of the exceptions. They eat about 22% insects, and then the rest of their diet is a whole lot of acorns, and then fruits, nuts, and grains. Does anybody have guesses for how many? How many acorns? Yay, okay. Many acorns. So it's gonna be about 100 acorns per day, and between 3,000 and 5,000 acorns per season. So they have, blue jays and oaks have a very special relationship together. They really rely on each other, and there's just about a ton of oaks that you can plant in your yard and your garden, and even some smaller varieties like the Quercus prenoides, the dwarf chinkapin oak. Can fit in a smaller space. So what are bird diets mostly composed of? We have about 432 bird species in the US that are insectivorous, and that's more than 1/3 of all bird species in the US. And if we don't have their food, these species are at risk of extinction, local extinction in urban and suburban areas. So the first resource I'll share is a podcast called Native Songbirds Need Native Plants. I think it's only about 30 minutes. I found it really interesting. It is like a conversational piece where they talk about the work of Dr. Desiree Narango. She also worked with Doug Tallamy, and she talks about the connection between songbird breeding success and the percentage of native plants in the local landscapes. I think this podcast has really helpful advice for steps that we can take as gardeners and in a local way to increase our local bird populations. So she used Carolina chickadees as a model bird to talk about how non-native plants affects birds during their breeding season. And she used the Carolina chickadees because 90% of their diet is composed of insects, especially during breeding season. What she found is that the local landscapes had to have 70% or higher native plant species in order to support a healthy native bird population. So 70% or higher. I think that's a good number that we can take away as gardeners as like a goal to include at least 70% native species in our own yards so that we can support these birds. And there are non-natives that do support some caterpillars, but on average, non-natives support about 40% fewer caterpillars. So that was part of her findings as well. So this is a map that you can find on the web. Audubon has like a bird migration explorer. It'll show you the migration patterns of different bird species. And in addition to our local birds that we have year round, we also have a really large population of migratory birds that fly through Maryland every year. And this is peak migration season now. So if you're a birder, you already know there are tons of birds that pass through that are exciting to watch, but we can also try and attract them to our yards or support them by, planting native and planting things that they would like to eat. Right now, I only have land birds toggled on. So like it says, songbirds, perching, tree-dwelling birds, and sparrows. And you can see us on that map there, and it's bright yellow. We have a lot of migratory species. So we'll start off in the fall. What do birds eat during fall migration? Their preferred diet, no surprise, insects. And as those insects population decreases, that is part of what helps trigger insectivorous birds to migrate. They're also consuming seeds from grasses like little bluestem, side oats, grama. We have native sunflowers and vervain. You can also plant viburnums, elderberry, spice bush, Virginia creeper. They all have fruits that ripen in the fall that fall migrants will use to fuel up for their journey. And then for birds that use nectar, there are plant species like jewelweed, lobelia, and turtlehead that you can plant for fall migrants. And this is one of the resources that I wanted to share. Audubon Great Lakes has a really nice, very short article that's packed with a ton of information. If you want to support fall migrants in your backyard garden and you're wondering what they eat, it has a great list, and it includes some of the things, like this list is directly from that article. It goes into more detail, so I would recommend if you are interested in that, saving that and checking that article out. So as an example of how to support fall migrants and how birds and plants are really, really closely linked, we have Lobelia cardinalis. The bloom time for Lobelia cardinalis is from July to September. And it is indeed not a coincidence that the ruby-throated hummingbird migration is from late August to September. So, again, those two are really, really closely related. This is another example of some of the plants that I mentioned that ripen in the fall, they also look really beautiful if you can plant them in fun combinations. That's elderberry planted with some goldenrod. So it's not just about, the practical considerations or the ecological considerations. You can also make some really beautiful combinations of plants. I really like that, the bright, bright purple of the elderberry berries paired with the goldenrod. So another example of this plants happening at the same time as the fall migration, you have the arrowwood viburnum. So fall migration occurs in the US between August 1st and November 30th. And the berries of the arrowwood viburnum, not as a coincidence, ripen between September and October. And those berries are high in fats, carbohydrates, energy, and antioxidants that birds need that are essential for that tough migration journey. And it's really beautiful. These plants are really gorgeous, and they have a lovely red color in the fall and beautiful bright berries. And in the spring, on the bottom right picture, in the spring, you can see it supports, its flowers support pollinators. So during spring migration, the preferred diets of spring migrants are spiders, worms, caterpillars, scale, they eat scale, mites and grubs. And then for your nectar, it's going to be species like columbine, penstemon, those Virginia bluebells, and crabapple that will support hummingbirds. And then they also eat, weirdly enough, flower buds of trees like elm and river birch. They also eat hop hornbeam and fruit tree buds of fruit trees. And that's the complementary article for the planting for fall migrants. This is planting for spring migrants. Another very accessible article that'll give you a bunch of great ideas if you want to support spring migrants in your backyard, community garden, whatever it may be. And these are some photos of those plants. On the left, you have columbine, and on the right, Virginia bluebells. And my favorite penstemon hirsutus. It's short and tolerates a lot of drought, which is good as our climate changes. And it has just these magnificent flower blooms. It's really great at like the front of a garden if you need something low growing. I really think it's a showstopper. So supporting birds during spring migration, right? It's not necessarily just about the seeds and the berries. We're also talking about the caterpillars. So some of the ways to support birds in your yard, in your community, involve just leaving things alone. So this is a picture of tent caterpillars. And while it's, we can maybe agree it's not the most beautiful thing, the Baltimore Orioles are certainly beautiful, and they feast on these tent caterpillars. They're one of many spring migrants that feast on tent caterpillars. And so sometimes, gardening for birds just means not being quite so tidy in your garden and letting things be. And the eastern tent caterpillars are directly linked to those spring migrants. So in early April, they hatch as they're coming out. Right in the middle of as they're coming out, you have that peak spring migration time in Baltimore, the end of April to about mid-May. And then, so right as they're, before they mature, they're nice smushy gushy snacks and treats for the, birds like those Baltimore Orioles. They're also eaten by over 60 species of birds. In addition to the Orioles, before they mature, they provide a great food source. And then once they mature at the end of May, they emerge as moths in June and then lay eggs for the next generation. And I don't have a slide on it here, but unsurprisingly, on the other end of that, in the fall, you have the fall webworms, which do the same thing for fall migrants. So I'm going to talk really briefly about invasive species. There are plenty of resources, for and talks that are specifically geared towards invasive species, but I did want to mention that birds can eat and spread invasive species, and I wanted to mention in particular things like Nandina that can be really toxic to birds, like cedar waxwings, due to its cyanide content. So it sort of slowly releases, and as the birds digest the berries, they have to ingest like more than just 1 or 2 berries, but if they've eaten enough, they will die. It will kill them. So I know Nandina is pretty popular. I live in Baltimore City, and it's used as a landscape plant all over the place. But there are many other options. The cedar waxwings, they sure eat all kinds of stuff. They really, as I was looking for photographs for this presentation, if you just search cedar waxwing on like the Wikimedia Commons images, like every other picture is the cedar waxwings putting some sort of red berry in their mouths. They eat all kinds of stuff. You do not have to plant just Nandina. They will eat things like pokeweed. There's a little cedar waxwing on the left there, giving the pokeweed a good stare down. They eat mulberries, which is in the middle. And on the right, you can plant winterberries. All those are great options. I don't know that you have to go out and buy pokeweed, but maybe if you have it in your garden, maybe consider letting it stay. Because maybe you want to see some cedar waxwings. They also eat plenty of other things like juniper berries from eastern red cedars. They eat the berries of dogwood, wild cherries. They eat blueberries, crab apples, and service berries. And they are one of the few bird species that can exist solely on berries for a few months. And then we'll talk about how invasive species harm birds. So for one, as we discussed before, invasive species don't really support native insects. So you're taking out a huge portion of the bird's diet. Migration and feeding young are really energy intensive periods in a bird's life. And if they don't have proper nutrition to get them through all the challenges that come with those life events, it could decrease their chances of survival. Invasive species are really good at displacing those important native plant species and decreasing biodiversity. So we've been discussing things that help fuel birds, and invasive species are actually the second leading cause to biodiversity reduction. So they end up destroying habitats, and their berries and seeds don't provide that same nutritional content that birds rely on. And then we'll learn about sort of why habitat is so important for birds next. So this is sort of, one of those wake-up calls. Cornell Lab of Ornithology published a study in 2019. It's the first ever comprehensive assessment of, net population changes in the US and Canada, and it reveals across the board declines that scientists call staggering. All told, the North American bird population is down by 2.9 billion breeding adults, with devastating losses among birds in every biome. And forests alone have lost 1 billion birds. Grassland bird populations collectively have declined by about 53%, or another 720 million birds. And it just means that the choices we're making as humans altering our habitat in large ways. And learning about how plants support birds is really critical to understanding how we make better choices that can positively impact bird populations. So does anybody know what this woody structure is called? if you want to put it in the chat. Snag! Yeah, it's a snag. All right. Yeah, so snags are a great way to support birds. Chickadees, like woodpeckers, are cavity nesters. This is one building a nest in a dead tree. And snags like this also offer opportunities for wood-eating insects, which then become food for mama and her babies. So what does this mean, for you as a gardener? If you can leave, some of a dead tree if it's feasible. If you can do that, all kinds of things will use it. So Stoneleigh Gardens is a great sort of like leads by example with this. In their presentation last year for the Greenscape Symposium, they discussed their use of the coronet cut. It mimics what happens in nature as a tree branch or top kind of tears away from its base. Stoneleigh Gardens leaves snags that are usually only about 10 to 14 feet tall, but in the case of this giant London plane tree in the middle, they decided to leave it as a giant like sculpture. I don't think you can see because the picture is a little small, but there are wires, so it's not just like it's gonna hopefully it's not gonna just topple on that mansion there. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend leaving something that big in your garden or near your home. But if you can even leave a small amount of a tree that's been cut down, it will certainly provide habitats for things. And on the right, you can see, all the little holes in the base of that tree and how they've used it as support for native vines and structure. And then on the left is that coronet cut I was talking about. The tree is likely older than Stoneleigh itself, at around 150 years old. And the garden staff was quoted as saying they didn't want to, obliterate it from our memory. And an arborist helped them remake the tree into a whole natural sculpture. They said, it still has so much story to tell and it has so much more to give the garden. It's not done. So another example of how to support birds, in your space is to leave things like brush piles. They harbor insects that birds can eat. They provide cover for birds to escape predators, and to seek shelter from weather events. So this is an example of a podcast I'd like to share that discusses habitat structure in a way that I thought was really accessible enough to understand, like as a non-expert. If you ever heard of the podcast called In Defense of Plants, I love all of their episodes, but some of their episodes are definitely above my head. And this one I thought was really fun. It's called Plant Structure and Habitat. And they had on a wildlife ecologist called Dr. Chris Moorman, and he talks about that direct link between the structure of a habitat and bird biodiversity. And he, in the episode, is quoted as saying, birds are so predictably connected to vegetation, and especially so predictably connected to vegetation structure. You could blindfold me, take me somewhere, let me out of the car, and I can hear the birds singing and I can tell you the vegetation condition simply by hearing the birds that are singing because they're so predictable. So highly, highly recommend this podcast. So this diagram is kind of like a visual representation of what he's talking about. It shows different types of birds in different levels of an ecosystem and how many layers there can be in an ecosystem, and that you can have a very simple it can be either very simple or complex based on the number of layers that have vegetation. For example, like a closed canopy forest with little understory has a simple structure, but any habitat will provide for some species and not others, and the composition sort of defines that successional stage of a plant community. So while you might have an early successional community that's dominated by grasses and forbs, that in itself defines the structure of the plant community, and thus like the species that are present in that habitat. So as a gardener, like what does that mean? As a gardener, I think we should, in order to maximize bird species richness at any level, we can diversify vegetation. And if you're wondering kind of like where to start, my garden can't be everything to everybody. If you wanted to choose a focal species and plant for that bird species, you can certainly approach it that way as well. And if you plant more of the structural layers, through those ground covers, some understory trees, mid and canopy species, you are more likely to have higher diversity in bird populations. And diversity doesn't necessarily mean, one of each plant, one of all of them. It means like things like, multi-season blooms. It means different types of plant species. So forbs, grasses, shrubs, and trees. And then I'm going to share, part of the reason that we're gathering here today and I'm doing this talk is, what happens when you don't have that structure. And I think Thames Street Park is a really great example for what happens when you don't have structure. So this is a park in the Fells Point neighborhood of Baltimore City. If you're familiar with where Patterson Park is, I included that on the map. It's right down there. It's really close to the water there. So Thames Street Park, as urban as it is, has, for some reason, an incredible number of black-crowned night herons, and they have formed a heron rookery there that has, at least 12 years of history, and some residents anecdotally can remember it being there even longer. Last year, there were 62 breeding adults, so 31 nested pairs, and then 31 nests established that had 29 of which had at least one hatch. So 50 fledged chicks, and then 11 chicks that had to be rescued and rehabilitated by Phoenix Wildlife Center. So this year, there are at least 6 chicks as of last week, and there are 24 nests that are actively incubating eggs, and there are 4 nests that are still under construction. And this, if anybody wasn't sure what a black-crowned night heron looked like, these are them. Those are the immature stage on the left, the chicks, and the parents on the right in their nest. So to talk about kind of like why this relates so directly to structure, we can look at the life cycle of the black-crowned night heron. So at about 4 weeks, the fledglings will start to move about in the trees. They're kind of testing things out. They begin to leave their nests, but they do not learn how to fly until 6 weeks old. So that means there's this 2-week period where they are moving about, leaving the nest, and they can't necessarily always make it back up into their nest because they do not know how to fly. So the needs are like soft landings. So as they leave the nest, they don't just fall, splat onto some stones and concrete, and then some shrubs or low branches to climb back into their nests. Now, black-crowned night herons are really unique in that if a chick falls from its nest, if it makes it back into a nest, any nest, the parents will care for that chick, whether it's theirs or not. It's called like colonial or community nesting. So as long as the chicks can make it back up into their nests, that already helps them a whole bunch. So our goals with this project are to, if you can see all of the stones underneath the trees there, those are Zelkova trees. Zelkova trees are not native, but we're certainly not about to take them out. They're obviously providing really important structural support for these birds. So what we do want to add are some native plants beneath them. so that instead of stones, they have some plants to help cushion their fall. And again, like I mentioned, ideally, once the shrubs grow up, get them back up to their nests. So our goals are to reduce the number of heron chick deaths over time, reduce the number of times humans need to intervene to save the chicks, because the neighbors do frequently have to intervene to save the chicks. We want to educate the general public about the presence of these birds, because I live 15 minutes away and I didn't know they were there. And I found it so fun to just drive over and check them out. You really, binoculars are great, but you don't even need binoculars to see them. They're not far above the ground. They're maybe like 15, 20 feet up. So even if you don't have binoculars, you can go check them out. We also want to, talk to people about why we're using native plants. While we aren't converting Thames Street Park back into, the high quality marsh habitat the herons would typically nest in, the native plants that are typically found in our woodlands will still serve a valuable purpose by providing pollinator habitat and, again, invertebrates, food for other urban birds. So in addition to helping the herons, yeah, it'll also help boost, local pollinator biodiversity. And my goal is to just like make people aware that this is like a thing right in the city. I think when we're aware of like the nature that's around us, we appreciate our space more. Watching birds has documented calming effects, and sort of like flowers, because these birds migrate in and out of the park, kind of like flowers, how you look forward to, maybe some of your favorite flowers coming back in your garden. This is like another sort of seasonal change that allows us to be sort of like more connected with, our neighborhoods and our city. So these are some of the species that we're going to be planting beneath the Zelkova trees. And like I mentioned, everything that's stone in there right now, everything that you can see that's stone, we're going to turn into plants. On the top there, some bottlebrush grass. It's a cool season grass and it can tolerate dry shade. There's Pacrauria, which spreads like anything, and can also tolerate some dry shade. We have some swamp milkweed, columbine, and there's some spotted bee balm, Monarda punctata, and some hoary mountain mint, Pycnanthemum mancanum, and some later season species. These are later season blooms. They're going to be two varieties of goldenrod, Solidago cassia or blue stem goldenrod. I don't know if that picture is a little small, but you can kind of see the blue stem. And then Solidago bicolor. We're going to plant white wood aster, which if anyone's grown asters, they can get out of hand sometimes, but white wood asters seem to be pretty well behaved, and they have these lovely, big explosions of white flowers. And then for some greenery, we're going to mix in some Christmas ferns, which can tolerate dry shade, and some Pennsylvania sedge. Help make it nice and cushy smushy. And then we're going to add about 5 shrubs to start with. The species we're going to use are northern bayberry, sweet pepperbush, and elderberry. And we're hoping that these species, will grow just tall enough where they can reach the bottom of that tree canopy. So those little herons, as they're hopping and bopping about, can jump up through the shrubs as they grow and make it back to their nests. Because truly the best parents of baby herons are adult herons. As much as we love Phoenix Wildlife Center and appreciate them so much, it is certainly hard work to rehab birds. It takes a lot of resources. So we are going to be doing tours of the heron rookery to give people a chance to use some binoculars. You're welcome to bring your own, but we will also provide some that people can share. The first one is gonna be May 17th, and then there's one in June and one in July. We're gonna have my partner Kevin Marshall is going to talk about. He's the one that takes all these amazing photos of the herons. He is out there all the time and is just obsessed with them. So he knows where all the new babies are, and he can tell you what to listen for. It's the new babies, they make these tiny little noises, and you wouldn't notice if you were just walking by, you wouldn't notice. So if you want to know what the baby herons sound like, you got to join one of these tours. Kevin will talk all about, he loves talking about the herons, so he's going to talk about the herons and share, all that he's learned about them. We're also going to have Phoenix Wildlife Center come out. They're going to talk about, heron rehabilitation, what to do if you find a heron on the ground and when you should rescue a heron chick, and then, how to do that, how to rescue a bird, because it's not quite intuitive. I think a lot of people, if you don't know, if you've never heard the advice before, they want to give, a bird food or water, and really like probably the best thing is just to keep them in like a dark place. So they're not, too stressed out, and then bring them as soon as possible to the wildlife rehabber. So if you're interested in learning more about the herons and hearing people talk about them and the rehabilitation, we're also going to have Baltimore Bird Club out there to talk about local birding opportunities and how to get involved. You can sign up for that. And then I just want to say, gardening for birds, what we do in our yards can make a difference for the local bird populations and for migratory bird populations. So for our birds here and for everybody's birds as they pass through. And I just wanted to share, different ways to notice the birds and see how they're using their garden, how to plant for them, and when to watch to see if they come. And if they don't come to your yard and you've been trying, maybe try and explore why. I also want to share that like some of the best ways to protect birds are to protect habitat where it already exists. Putting this project together has meant a lot for me, but it's also it's also a lot of work, and I hope it helps the herons, but protecting habitat where it already exists is definitely the best way to help birds. And there's so many pieces of this ecosystem, right, that fit together. The caterpillars with the spring migrants and the columbine and the lobelia with the hummingbirds, and they just fit together like little puzzle pieces. And keeping those, habitats that already support birds intact is really important. It's truly impossible for us to create gardens that can fill every niche and provide for every bird. There's an incredible diversity of ecosystems in the US for a reason. So there are a lot of developmental projects like the high voltage power lines and stuff that have the potential to destroy huge swaths of existing habitat. So to me, gardening for birds also means, voicing your concerns about the dwindling numbers of birds and about habitat destruction. And, again, what we're doing in creating these beautiful native plant gardens really is very important and much needed.
Brigit, can I ask you to repeat the power line that you mentioned?
Oh yeah, the high voltage power line project. It's set to come through like a huge portion of Maryland's like protected lands. I don't have like a link to share for that, but I think it's pretty readily searchable and I could probably find it.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, what we're doing in our own gardens is also really important. And I know watching birds like in my garden and trying to plan out how to make that highest quality habitat has brought me a lot of joy. And so I do hope that this sparks sort of an interest in gardening for birds. And if you do not have a garden of your own, please join me in this event. It's going to be a planting event in October. If you want to get your hands dirty and put some native plants in the ground and help some really cool birds, I'd love for people to sign up to help out with this project.
So anyone who can't make the May 17th date. There are 2 alternate dates she's going to give us.
Yes, this one. June 21 will be the next one. There we are. That's the June 21st event. And we're only doing 30 spots because it's sort of, so if you're interested, I would probably try and sign up sooner rather than later. And this is July 12th. Hope everyone can participate if you're local. Yeah, and thank you for joining.
Thank you, Bridget.